KV Ganapati, who is CEO of JASCAP.
Yeah.
So I spent time memorizing it yesterday, Ganapati.
Oh God.
JEET, Association for Support for Cancer Patients.
Right, right.
So Ganapati is a clinical psychologist who volunteers at the Department of Palliative Medicine, both pediatric and adult, at the Tata Memorial Hospital in Mumbai. And he's done a lot of academic work, both at the national and international level, and member of the Central Council. And he is pursuing a PhD in adolescent psychology. And he's going to take us through how do you communicate to adolescent and young adults. I think that's a very interesting subject. So, Ganpati, hearty welcome,
Thank
and
you so
please
much.
take it
Thank
away
you so
from
much.
here.
Yeah.
All yours.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Good morning, all of you, once again on a Monday morning. Thank you so much for, getting out of your sleep at such an early hour to listen to this session. So I have an additional responsibility of ensuring that I engage you with the kind of content that I'm here to present. Before I start, I wanted to make a point very clear that communication itself is not very difficult, but the kind of population that we are talking about, adolescents especially, because of their niche, aspect and niche developmental challenges and the profile that they are, that's what makes communication very challenging. Uh, Perhaps in our clinical settings, the challenges are very prominent because um, probably the healthcare workers who are talking to them are not really aware of what an adolescent is made of. Having gone themselves through those aspects, I think they find it even more difficult to, grapple with what an adolescent is. So my presentation has got three parts, and the larger chunk of it, although I don't want to make it look like one postgraduate psychology class, it's very essential that some of the participants might have knowledge about adolescence, but for the benefit of many others, I'm going to take you through what is this adolescence that we're talking about, their psychosocial profile, their psychosocial challenges, and in the wake of cancer, how these psychosocial challenges gets exacerbated, and that's how the communication is challenged. Having said Having said that, the most important thing is I'm also going to touch upon the case that I handled during last year at the onset of pandemic. That what happened when I had to talk to an adolescent remotely when he was requesting on team times that whether we can meet personally or not, but the pandemic wouldn't let me. So there was additional challenge to that. So that's what I'm going to take. But right away, I'm going to give a disclaimer that one case, what I went through, brought up so many issues. I'm not, generalizing that it'll always be that way, but essentially, probably the future research can, take on the thread from this particular narrative, so that we have a rich understanding of how to communicate and help, this population called as adolescents to deal with their emotions at a very crucial time when the disease worsens. So having said that, am I audible? Am I clear? Is the pace of speech clear? Hello?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you, Nagin. Thank you. Thanks so much. So let's look at, the provision of age-appropriate communication is a very, very important element in the care of palliative patients. There are enough evidences that says that highlights the negative impact of poor communication and consequently poor psychosocial care. And adolescents are always at a greater risk of developing this severe and complex pattern of distress than other age group. And that's why this emphasis on how do we communicate with them becomes even more important. And this, complex pattern gets contributes to further distress because of the disease that they are encountering. So we, however, in our clinical setting, we don't see very often adolescents being involved in making end-of-life discussions, or I don't think we have opportunities to even involve them in the communication. And even if it happens, it is hurried through at the end of really end of life, where we don't give them a chance for psychological preparedness of the final event, not only the adolescents but also the families. Having said that, when we say that the adolescent is not just ruled by hormones, but also by the upheaval of emotions, as Dr. Amol Anuday said, that you have to understand there are 4 common dimensions of emotion experience an adolescent goes through. Frequency. There is how often does the adolescent and the young adult often feel a particular emotion. That is, if they are happy, how often they feel, or if they are sad, how often they feel that sadness. The second is the intensity, the strength of the particular emotion. I mean, how strong and the magnitude is the emotion. So what does this happiness makes them do, and how does the sadness make them do? And typically we have seen anger overpowering many of the situations. And that is why we see enough crimes in the field of adolescence. Then, of course, the instability, the degree to which this emotion fluctuates, how often or how not so often times this emotions fluctuates. And finally, clarity, that is, are the adolescents able to unambiguously label the emotions? They are able to identify them. That means many times, even in our clinical setting, when we're talking to them about a diagnosis and trying to understand what the perception is about this prognosis getting worsened, most of the time the anger is raging, as you could see on the face, but it is masked under a complete silence. There is a pervasive silence over there. So understanding these 4 aspects will help us to temper our communications and kind of make a difference to their current state that they're going through. So having said that, before you start understanding, there is a very, very interesting thing that you have to understand, that Erik Erikson was a great man who really spoke about, I think I've skipped a slide, just a minute. Yeah, sorry. So you have to understand this Erik Erikson, because as all of us know, adolescence is marked by 2 or 3 very, very important characteristics like autonomy, self-identity, sexual identity, etc. And therefore, it is very difficult to understand a little bit of genesis of it. So Erik Erikson was somebody who was credited with exploring this personality through the lifespan. And there he essentially talks about 8 stages which a human being goes through. And interestingly, at the turn of every life stage, even, there's a crisis. How does that individual manage to handle that crisis? How successfully and how effectively does he deal with that crisis? Helps him to move on to the next stage in a more effective manner. Any individual who is not able to handle the crisis effectively can spill over and contaminate the next state that you're talking about. And in that context, of course, we'll only be talking about 3 very, very important states that he's talking, which is very relevant to adolescent and young adults. One is industry versus inferiority. Of course, I'll explain this even a little more. And when you're talking about this industry and inferiority, we are talking about developing a sense of competence at all useful tasks. That is the stage where the adolescent from the age of 6 to 12 tries and struggles to understand and develop a sense of competence. Okay, so he tries to, that's the beginning of he or she trying to find answers, trying to find out problem solving, etc. And thus they start developing the very, very useful skills. And that's what is the first step to their getting an identity of a problem solver. So the next, the state that we're talking is identity versus role diffusion. That is how well the person is able to, group and develop all his skills and carve a niche for himself and creates an identity through development of competence. And also the social identity, the interaction that he has got. and a question about his sexual identity, and if not handled properly, can diffuse the role completely. And then the third and the most important thing is the intimacy. That's where he understands a meaningful relationship, the concept of fidelity, etc. And if he fails there, then he becomes completely isolated, and it can, impact very badly the subsequent stages. So therefore, I leave you with a thought right here that an adolescent development depends on these three stages of industry versus inferiority, identity versus role diffusion, and intimacy versus role isolation. So we are starting with an adolescent, starting his task of developing skills and competence, using those skills and competence to his situations, careers, employments, etc., and also learning fidelity, meaningful relationship. And all these three are extremely important. Any questions so far? I'll move ahead. Okay, so going from these three important tenets that we just now spoke about, industry versus inferiority, identity versus role diffusion, and intimacy versus isolation, the fundamental profile of an adolescent is to stand out. That is, how does he manage to develop a stable sense of self through the competency and the skills that he has developed. And that's what helps him to pursue autonomy. Okay, and this is what is, clearly marking his sense of confidence. And if he fails here, it'll completely undermine his lack of self, and lack of confidence. And here, this is the place where he tries to master new skills. And otherwise, if he fails here, then he gets into self-doubt. So that's how the first thing talks about. The second is, how does he manage to fit in? When he talks about fit in, what kind of relationship does he develop? Because as I told you, the peer acceptance, peer relationship is extremely critical at this stage. That social identity contributes your sense of self-worth and gives and optimizes your self-confidence. And therefore, it is very, very important for that adolescent to see how he fits into his peer relationship. And the third is, of course, the most important thing. How does he measure up? That is, how does he continue to go through the task of developing competence to become more and more stronger in terms of developing decision-making skills, problem-solving skills, information processing skills, etc. And then, of course, finally, with all this thing that is able to, he has created a niche for himself, he has created a sense of identity, and he is autonomously able to take decisions. He has got excellent peer relationship. With all this thing, he takes a hold of himself, and that's when he starts his most important journey of, committing to the goals, activities, and beliefs. So, in a way, the profile that he, that his personality can bring out is that who am I as an individual? And that sets the pace for his adulthood. That sets his pace for his subsequent adulthood. So having from here, let's look at one very important thing, and that is normally when we talk about adolescent, we are talking about an element of risk, which is very, very prominent. And what is risk all about? There are, as I told you, the adolescent masters this, new skills, and he employs those skills and this competence to a particular task. How successful is the person finding his competence and his newly developed skills to accomplish this task? He takes a reasonable amount of risk to get into that. That is one kind of risk behavior. So, therefore, gets in a lot of, finding right information, trying to do a lot of research and trying to validate his own observations and his thoughts, etc. And adolescent at this point in time also gets into an abstract mode. That means he's able to think about his thoughts, and he tries to use his abstraction to very constructively move towards a problem solving and decision making. Now, when he fails over here, the other kind of risk that he's talking is, how does he cope to, handle this failure to succeed in one of these areas of standing out, measuring up, or peer relations? So this risk is classified into two areas. Sorry for this, the error in the slide of the words. So what did we learn? What did we see just now? Adolescence, after he creates a social profile or a overall personality profile for himself, one very important thing that that makes the adolescent very distinct from an older adult is the risk involved. What does he do and how does he manage to accomplish his task versus what does he do if the task accomplishment fails? And in both there are risks. Okay, now we come to, so what did we do? We kind of, I quickly do an overview. We went into understanding the landscape of adolescents and the young adults, that, the emotional upheaval, that they are made of so much of emotional this thing, and how frequently, intensively, and also marked by instability and clarity, this emotional trajectory is, all pervasive. And within that, they try to create a profile of themselves by, creating an identity, by creating autonomy, by developing very clear peer relationship, and employs appropriate risk in order to preserve this, to take it to fruition, or sometimes they are not able to handle these emotional upheaval, and therefore they are not able to achieve the task, and they employ a different kind of risk in order to cope with that failure. So this is the landscape of adolescence, which I thought is important for, we people, whether we are social workers or whether we are counselors, and more importantly, the frontline doctor who's constantly dealing with these kind of patients, and of course the nursing staff are also there. And therefore, a bit of understanding about our adolescent profile will help them to, talk about very effective methods of facilitation, to have relevant content in their communication, and the most important thing, the way they time it. And that's exactly what the literature says, and that's exactly what I found in my one case that I handled in the last year during pandemic, when I was counseling one of the adolescent. So the theory of development says that everybody experiences all kinds of disruptions. However, when it comes to adolescents and young adults who are facing cancer, these disruptions mean completely different. It is quite different from the normal life disruption that we see. However, these disruptions are projected based on the importance one gives to different issues. The way a cancer patient, feel that the life is disrupted. That's why when we break the bad news, we always try to find out, what does this diagnosis mean? How does the individual or their family members, and especially an adolescent, how does he perceive this onset of cancer at a time when he's the most important developmental milestone of his life, which is quite different from an older adult who probably has lived life, and most of his, familial, his own personal needs are met with. But yes, still there could be disruptions. However, not as grave as the disruptions which an adolescent will feel. So theory of development posits that all cancer patients experience a set of disruptions, each experiencing differently to different issues, depending on the time of the onset. That's the most important thing. Disruptions in life goals, as they appear, go ahead, move ahead, surge ahead. However, the adolescent can experience altered relationship, renewed dependency, and independency syndrome. So we'll come to all that as we progress in this slide. The most important thing, imagine a young adult, I had this case of a 26-year-old young adult who was engaged, and unfortunately, between the time of engagement and marriage, he developed one of the blood cancers, ALL, and obviously, as most of the doctors here, the prognosis is not very great. So both the families came to talk whether what should they do about the impending marriage. Is it better to call off? And incidentally, both of them were engineering students who had started dating and courting right from their 12th standard, pursued engineering, dreamt of a great future, and here, unexpectedly, one big blow in the form of cancer came. While the two families were very, pertinently trying to raise this issue of whether to call off the wedding or not. The boy in concern, for him, when I asked him that what would he like to do, the most important thing he said, and so it was a both eye and ear opener for me. He said, "Sir, when my two families are, talking about to call off the wedding, I don't know from where they are coming, but for me, at this stage, I'm finding it extremely difficult." Incidentally, the girl did not know. The most challenging things that I will have is how do I share this part and how it is going to impact my sexuality. Probably you have thought, you have read somewhere, and the the dent or the impact the treatments will have, because I've heard that chemotherapy can cause a lot of problems, and if I'm supposed to go for radiation therapy, where I can have a disfigurement and therefore my body image. So fundamentally his issue was his identity, his body image, and more importantly his sexual identity, which was a big concern for him to share. We saw in the stage of intimacy versus isolation. And this is exactly the stage this young adult was caught. Okay. And of course, another very important thing is, as I told you, when they profile, typically in the case of adolescents, when they are talking about, acceptance with peers, and when they are talking about, their sense of self-worth, where appearance contributes a lot, at this point in time, a cancer diagnosis really brings them to confront mortality at a premature time. That is why the disruptions at the lifetime, at that point in time when I'm beginning to start my life with all my competence, with all my skills, with all the sense of self-worth and confidence that I carve for myself, at this point in time, I have to be confronting this mortality. And of course, the literature is also rich with one of the facts about fear of loss of reproductive ability. In fact, if I may just take a one experience that I did come across as through my research, which is about coping mechanism of adolescents who are diagnosed with ALL. In my interview, one of the concerns many of the adolescents they spoke about was their fear of loss of reproductive ability. Having said that, in the context of cancer, these adolescents and young adults who are in the throes of starting new life socially and independently, in terms of their achieving goals, in terms of setting up a family, in terms of taking the family ahead, the cancer forces on them a new meaning of physical attractiveness. And there's a dichotomous feeling of not looking normal, but at the same time, I'm the same person. This is very, very interesting, because of the fear of the treatment and the impact of the treatment, and post that the weight loss, weight gain because of steroids, my nasal tubes, my hair loss, all this thing is causing so much of distress to me that I'm not looking normal, and looking in the mirror gives me absolute goosebumps, and it kind of breaks my sense of self. But at the same time, I'm also saying I'm the same person, right? Therefore, coming to understand this also and coming to terms with this is equally challenging. The social isolation, and therefore that because cancer treatment can cause untold miseries in terms of side effects, their state, the risk of preserving, remember the coping I said, they enter into risk behavior by non-compliance to treatment. There is very, very poor communication between parents, and their adolescent results in a lot of behavioral disturbances. Many times in the clinic, when I'm asked that, are you in touch with your peers, whether in, in the college or in your place of work, is that no, I have not told people. They just know that I'm not well. I don't want them to come and see me. I don't want them to come and look at me in this state. Okay. And therefore, the same peer relationship, which was very important in the wake of cancer, they slowly want to withdraw, and they want to grapple with their own adolescence. And then, of course, the psychosocial issues are monumental. It is very difficult to maintain normalcy as physical and social development is attacked. I thought specifically to talk about these areas because as you taper your communication, you need to understand this, and it's not going to be you have a spikes protocol or you have a nurse protocol, you go bang onto it. You have to keep this in the background before you start actually talking. And very important thing is, as the end of my presentation would focus that this is one reason if we could start this communication at a time when we feel that the patient is somewhat well or somewhat asymptomatic, and we start talking about these issues, about how the prognosis is going to be. Of course, it's a challenge there that at a time when he's very, very, asymptomatic, or he doesn't feel, these symptoms do not contribute so much of distress to him. He's still able to manage some of his daily activities. The challenge is whether we should talk to him or we should not talk to him. That's the question I've asked at the end of the presentation to some of the, stalwarts who are present over here. So having said that, the challenges in the wake of, altered this thing, it's definitely, it's about, the first thing is your own self-esteem is challenged. When you see that your peers are going ahead, they are going to work, they are having an interaction among themselves, they are now begun to take care of their life, and for them is a future challenges that is very exciting. You are docked either in the hospital, going through treatment regimens, or you're locked in the house at home, wondering and worrying about the kind of uncertainty, and a sense of uselessness actually creeps, and that creates a havoc with the self-esteem, because you're feeling absolute loss of self-control. And at a time when independence was very, very critical for you, because you were in the phase of exploration, you have a renewed dependence on your parents. And this also triggers anger phenomenally. And as I told you, like in the earlier case, decreased peer contact. You're doing everything to withdraw and do not want to project that loss of self-esteem, which can come out in very ugly form. And therefore, and you don't like while your peers are, are going about with their life, you have to be dependent on your parents. And it's really overwhelming to see sometimes in the clinical setting, 60 plus odd, frail looking father pushing the wheelchair of, a early 20 or late 20 person, coming for treatment or coming to the OPD. And you can imagine what and how that individual feels about the self-esteem. And of course, the self-esteem, definitely the after effect of the treatment. And of course, and in all this thing, the fundamental thing is effect on fertility and sexual identity, about which we have spoken. And continuity about their career, their education goals, and doubts about their competence. And that's when the sense of self-worth and the lack of confidence starts creeping in. And the intersection of cancer with such development task starts getting into it. And that's what makes this young adult or this adolescent completely withdraw from any kind of interaction. That is why communicating with that adolescent especially becomes a little more challenging. For a young adult, depending again whether he's married or is unmarried as a child, for example, I had a case of an early 30, a person who had a cancer of buccal mucosa, who was brought to the OPD, and after the doctor spoke to him about the prognosis and breaking the bad news, when the patient was sent for talking to me about the ramifications of this, understanding this prognosis, ramifications of learning this prognosis, he got up and he kind of almost hugged me to say, Dr. Saab, जो भी हो, मेरे 6 साल का बेटे के लिए मुझे बचाओ, मैं आगे से सिगरेट की तरफ देखूंगा भी नहीं. So can you imagine the distress that he undergoes, and therefore it is very, very critical for we who are in touch with these situations need to look at how we communicate. Now we come to this adolescents and this young adults in the palliative setting. Of course, our ground is completely different. It is different from the Western world, which is a lot of research, which has got a lot of evidences, or they are still working on it. The most important thing is there is these adolescents, when after knowing the diagnosis, going through the phase of treatment, they go through the treatment protocols, chemotherapy or probably surgery and post-surgery radiation, whatever it is, there is an element of hope. They believe that they could get. And many times in the wake of the therapeutic interventions, the adolescent or the young adult also probably shows some kind of improvement in the symptoms like better appetites, better sleep quality, better ambulations. And at that point in time, he still manages to get into contact with some probably very, very close peer, and still tries to project or feels that he can still manage. But when this goals of care is transitioned, when eventually, despite all these therapeutic interventions, if the disease comes back and the way the health, the primary unit, um, is involved in the transition of this patient to the palliation. I don't know whether they check or whether they have told and they have clarified how much does this adolescent or young adolescent is clearly aware that he is being sent because the treatment options are very limited and the medical regimen is almost closer to not very great, and therefore he is being referred to the Department of Palliative. But more often we have seen that when they come to the Department of Palliation, for them it is another OPD, there's another doctor who's going to examine him or her, and another person, another doctor or a healthcare team, which is going to assess, evaluate, and give them medicines. For them, this medicine is completely, getting into curative mode, because we are also telling them that we also probably overemphasizing about this, addressing the symptoms and how you are as a doctor making an attempt to address and relieve the patient of such symptoms. But having said that, once again, we are not so much helping this adolescent or young adult to go off the hook. We still want to kind of make him be a little away from the edge of the cliff. But some of them, of course, say that, this is the best that we could do. And depending on the level of education, the expressiveness of the patient or the caregiver, they do ask, what does this mean that this is what it can do? So the first shade of bad news comes to them, that their disease is irreversible despite all these things, and why the mainstream treatment options have been closed and why they have been sentenced. Now, this adolescent or the young adult who was, hopping on and off in terms of peer interactions, family dependence, carers dependence, etc., suddenly gets into a secondary isolation. Now he knows that the situation is hopeless. There is not going to be an improvement. And therefore, he sees that his dreams, his sense of competitiveness, and all the competing the task that he had developed, is of no use to him. I distinctly remember this 29-year-old man who was wheeled into the palliative OPD way back. And when his father was told, and the patient was a topper, is an engineer of one of the reputed institutes in Mumbai. So he was also told, and the doctor spoke in a very nice manner about why this department and what is going to happen and why is this disease progress, etc. As soon as it was over, the first thing that patient looked at his father and he said, "Are you happy now? You wanted me to become an engineer. I have become. Now, what did I achieve?" And that was a starting point that pushed him into further isolation, completely withdrawn from all his peers. Everybody started, people who were visiting the hospital started coming. He did not want even his caregivers to come. He said, "Leave me alone." And it was, little difficult for us to manage him for first 48 hours as he wanted to be in that isolation, because of course we have to also look at other aspects. So that secondary isolation triggers untold anger. And because of the disease, the most important thing, adolescents, what we see is because of the siblings who are 1 or 2 years, here and there, continue their lifetime, life activities without any restriction, without any impositions, and they are as usual, pursuing these goals. And when this patient sees this, he or she is, distressed even more. And there are enough, literature that talks about this sibling rivalry, even at the stage when the patient is going through all these things. And in the palliative setting, this adult or the young adult is forced to adapt to serious life-altering illness. And that's the platform, that's the state when we get into, and we are thinking of, or we are trying to muster courage. We are trying to, scrape through all our skills as to how we are going to talk to the patient about the approaching end of life, or the worsening of the prognosis. The most important thing, we as a person who is going to talk to the ramifications, one of the most important things is how do we take control of our own emotions. We feel bad, obviously, and that feeling of bad, because of the condition, is extremely threatening to us. And you, unless and until you don't take charge of that, I think you should not start getting into talking about to the patient about the worsening of the prognosis, because more often times you will end up going contrary to your intention of bringing comfort. You might end up hurting the patient, and in turn you will also exacerbate your sense of hurt. So that is very, very important over there. Okay, so there was a very interesting paper about communication with challenges with adolescents. The adult and Abraham, and the paper says, the study says that one of the biggest challenges of communication is adult disposition versus adolescent cognitive maturity. While the adolescent, dons the, disposition of a full-blown adult, and he's ready, he's, he talks about right to information, and he wants to talk about his patient autonomy, and I must know about all these things. After all, it's my career, it's my goal, etc., which is largely to be respected, to be understood. But we don't know whether this adult disposition that he's projecting, or perhaps he has, is it backed by, or is it supported by appropriate cognitive maturity, age appropriate? So that is one of the biggest challenges, because we've seen when he listens, because when the doctor gives into, or the doctor involves in that discussion, then we have also seen where this adolescent who was struggling with that exploration and independence now realizes that renewed dependence and increased dependence is going to be the reality, and there's nothing much he can do. He gets into that dependency syndrome, and this age appropriate maturity, or the lack of it, does not help him to understand the complexities of the communication which the doctor is trying to drive home at. So that's one thing. And also the most important thing, as I've seen in many clinical settings, without blaming anybody, a very normal emotional feeling is that when the patient is symptomatically doing well, then there is a question: should I now break the bad news to him? What will happen to his motivation? And your own thoughts are also being kind of reinforced by the caregivers. So that's one valid reason for you to withhold. Or you wait till the symptom worsens and the patient is wondering, despite visiting the hospitals, meeting doctors, why is that his condition is worsening. And that's the time he is really talking to this thing about, tell me what is happening. He's asking doctors what is happening. By then the time is, we've lost the opportune moment. So this challenge has been very, very beautifully brought out, and I'm sure most of the doctors who are listening to me, or most of the counselors who are listening to me, would resonate that while the the adolescent or the very young adult has the disposition of the adult. He perhaps does not, is not supported by able cognitive maturity, and also the fact that the doctors increasingly tending to fall back on the symptomatic improvement. That's what in one of the paper, the starting of the collusion, where we have a recovery plot and we kind of sandwich, or we wait till the, the symptom worsens and we just hurry through this end of life discussions, as a matter of fact. So another paper, which talks about Ursula Andress communication needs. This was one of a very important study, where a qualitative study where participants and carers from 74 institutions, totaling to 13,000 odd patients and their families were interviewed. And narrative method says that the unique psychosocial challenges increases their vulnerability when treatment is unsuccessful. That's what we just spoke. And there is very little guidance in the best practices in end-of-life communication. Though the potential benefit of early palliative care establish in the cancer trajectory establishes the better quality outcome and better psychological preparedness for the final event, and also perhaps the better psychosocial outcome. Okay, so having said that, we went through the landscape of adolescence. We went through the the pros and cons of the communicating with adolescents and the young adults. Some empirical aspects, some facts. Now here comes the case reference. This was in last July when I was called to counsel a 19-year-old male with a relapsed, AML during the induction phase itself. The patient, when the clinician was telling the father that now the treatment is closed, you didn't use this word, but the treatment options are limited, and therefore you are being sent to the Department of Palliative Care, and what is going to happen there? Okay, this was directed at the father of the patient, but the patient was in the distance of hearing in bits and pieces when the doctor discussing the prognosis of the patient's father. Patient's case transferred to Department of Palliative Medicine. Palliative physician discusses the future plan with the patient and his father. Father is of course running a grocery shop and is semi-literate, don't know, but he knew that now the treatments are not there. So somewhere he caught on that ab kuch nahi hoga. Now, to give a little bit of the background, the patient's sister is currently pursuing high school and academically very strong. Patient himself is the only graduate, and he was waiting to complete his graduation, and he had a lot of plans discussed with his peers. And despite coming from a not so great social strata or financial background, he had immense confidence in his own strength, and that made him single-mindedly focus on his academics, waiting to end his graduation so that he could bail out his father and the family from the current financial difficulties that they have and create an identity for himself. And fortunately, he was also very good in academics. However, the mother, who just knew that her son was undergoing treatment for cancer, had no clue about anything other than the disease, and the patient was referred to me for breaking the bad news. So in that condition, the father calls me and he says that he has just now met the palliative physician, and the physician has referred him to talk, and subsequently also to talk to the patient. Now, as the father was talking to me, the patient, I could make out, snatched the telephone, and then he asked me 10 point-blank questions. So here, I, as a counselor, remotely, not looking at being able to look at the patient repeatedly requesting for personal meeting, but pandemic posing a big challenge, and that time the lockdown was very strong. I could not move out of the house. The patient cannot meet me for the fear of getting infected, blah, 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 blah. He had questions, and those questions, the narratives of the questions and the discussion can be summed up in one, master theme, that is lost opportunities. The saddest part of it was, as the communication was going on, the adolescent did not even have a window to grieve for what is impending. His anticipatory grief had already started, and he started accumulating one after the other lost opportunities. So let's quickly look at the patient. What was lost for him? His dream of completing the education and helping his family, bailing them out of the current situation. He thought, the first question that he asked me was, I'm not so much bothered about what is going to happen to me. I know that, I didn't have enough chance. The doctors have tried all they could, but still God has some other plans for me. But I want to know whether will my family, who will be left and bereft without me, what kind of support they will get. Okay, I was dreaming of making my sister a teacher, and now without me, I don't know whether that's going to happen. Okay, I who was planning to, complete my graduation and take my family to a different trajectory altogether. Now everything is lost. So the reason why I'm exploring all this thing is probably in the future communication. As I told you that. Uh, Talking about the facilitation, can the person who's initially talking about the bad news can have these concerns roped into it? And for the family, the future opportunities. Completely, the father was looking at his education completion, his graduation, his getting a job as the primary source of support. And now has to grapple with this information that his prognosis is worsening, and there is nothing more that clinically we could do to salvage the situation. Then for me as a counselor and as a part of the healthcare team, I lost out on the opportunities of helping the patient and the family for psychological preparedness. So it was whole lot of opportunities for the patient, the family, and the counselor. So from this, as the narrative was unfolding, it became more and more clear that how the content has to be important. Even more important is the timing as to when you have to start, and appropriately which healthcare team member, definitely with the doctor, with the help of somebody else, of his team member who perhaps is well versed in tapering this communication age appropriately, and therefore able to also help the healthcare team to handle the distress arising out of this communication is what perhaps we as palliative community need to work on the future researches. And to end my presentation, the three core themes that came was facilitation, who should, how should, and when should, were the three important things. The timing. Now, one of the things that I felt very, very bad besides pandemic is that I wish I had met this person, because he had so many questions for which I could not really think of answers, because these questions came most unexpectedly and the first conversation itself. And I knew that I was not going to meet because there was no let up in the pandemic. So there was no way I could, kind of tell him. But the interesting thing is when the father called me to announce sometime late September about the demise of the son. And after that, he said, when the pandemic ends, I'm going to meet you. And sure enough, sometime later on, when the curves were eased, he really came, he met me, and the discussion that I had with the patient was a document that we had made. And he says, this is my future mission. And I'm asking God to give me strength that this discussion that he had and the pointers that he has made, I will at least try and strive to remove at least partly some of the opportunities that the family has lost. So resonating with the evidences and the single case, which is of course, as I write in the beginning, I told the disclaimer that, I will not want to generalize, but it has given a fillip, it has given a kind of a trigger that when, and the fact that in the Indian setting, perhaps we don't have enough studies to substantiate, or I could not lay my hands at it, but I would seek and welcome some of the doctors who are there in the platform today, some of the psychologists and the mental health professionals who are today, whether we could do a study to come up with how we could help these adolescents and young adolescents. And most importantly, this conversation that we're talking end of life is whether it's a medical information, developmental age appropriation, psychosocial, family, ethical issues, existential distress, everything, all this result, converges at three important things. At what time, what domain of, how will you stitch your content with what domain, at what time, and who will facilitate. And all these things are likely to differ according to the individual character of each AYA, in their family context, the society, culture, and the backdrop. Thank you so much. And thank you so very much to IPC and all of you spending an early morning on Monday morning and listening to me. And with that, I end my presentation and I'm open to questions.
Thank you very much, Ganpati, for taking us through what I think is a difficult subject. Arun, any questions? I don't see them on the chat, but maybe you can throw it open for people to ask.
One question just came in. Ganpati sir.
Yeah.
Question for you.
Yeah. What is the question?
When a child or adolescent with a life-limiting illness asks the question, am I going to die? How do you answer the question? And how should a physician control his or her emotions when breaking bad news?
Thank you. Who's the person who's asking this question?
Mukaila Akinwale.
Okay. Thank you so much, Mukaila ji. If you remember, somewhere in the presentation, I said before we start the communication, whoever is communicating that individual, how sorted out he or she, right? When we approach this as a matter of duty, perhaps there is a fear of rushing into it, and therefore I've seen many times the person who's, talking about this worsening of prognosis, or even for that matter, the counselor who's addressing the ramification, himself or herself dispositionally and also mentally goes through a lot of challenging time. Unless and until you do not handle that, I don't think you'll be greatly successful. That is the first thing. The second thing is, as you start, that's where a bit of the spikes protocol that we're talking about. Before you cannot go headlong into, oh, now your prognosis is worsening, that we cannot do anything. You should have had enough conversation with the family and get a kind of a thing that while they are in the mode of collusion, that don't tell the patient, because of blah, 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 blah. You must also be very upfront telling that if the patient asks, I cannot hide it from him because he's got the right to know. And fundamentally, while you're working to break that collusion, you must also try and find out what is the fear and see whether you can handle it. So by the time you do all this in the first 2 rounds, by the time you come to the 3rd round, in presence of the family caregiver, the question that you posed just now, okay, that can you tell me what is happening to me, or am I going to die, or whatever it is, you have to take one of the family carers to see, okay, how do you want to answer this question? What do you want to do that? Sometimes that may work, okay? Sometimes the perception, asking the question or trying to find out why this question has come to the mind of the person. Why is he feeling so? So you clarify the perception a little bit. It will give you some leeway as to how much the person has understood. And these symptomatic distresses problem that has been, coming through, strengthening the trajectory of the disease or the worsening of the prognosis. What does he understand by that? Earlier it was not there, now it is there. What do you make out of this? So you have to follow the path and say, yes, these are because of what your reports show. You remember you had a recent PET scan, and this scan report, a scan, and the doctor has seen the scan, and it shows that despite the medication or the therapy, it is, the disease has come back, and that is why you got all the symptoms. So, and the second part of Spike's protocol, that how do you taper? You are going to give all this information in chunks. So like how the stages of development as a crisis, every chunk that you're going to talk will have a crisis. How did you let go the first chunk of information? What kind of, I'm using a wrong word perhaps because I'm not able to get comfort, or how did it alter the perception of the patient? And what is his understanding that is you have clarified will lead you to the next chunk of information. So it will be a process. It cannot be definitely a one-time, one-shot, which is really, throws a lot of challenge. I hope I've managed to answer your question, ma'am.
One last question, sir.
Yeah.
Sima madam is asking,
Yeah.
Could you please throw some light on adolescents' understanding of death? Last question.
Um, the adolescent, before we understand, as we see it in the early adolescent, they begin to understand that. But generally, the understanding, the adolescent in 18 or 19, like the case I'm talking about, he had known what exactly death is. That is, it is going to be irreversible, it is non-functional, it is complete, it is universal, etc. But how do we understand what that death is? I had this 15-year-old girl from eastern part of the country, absolutely asymptomatic, Ewing sarcoma. So when I was talking to her, initially I started off this rapport building conversation about her, her college, her favorite subjects, her favorite professors, all these things. Then I said, the moment I asked her that, are you still in touch with your, college mates, your batch mates? And that's the time she broke down. So from such situations, I'm beginning to understand in the middle adolescence, perhaps their understanding of death could also be that their normalcy of completely getting disconnected from their peers and completely not being able to do what their peers are going to do is what they understand death. But when you, in the late adolescence, 18, 19, they completely understand death as universal, non-functional, it is, irreversible, etc. Anything more that you want to add, Seema?
Yeah, Ganpati, I'm going to make use of my privilege as the coordinator of this talk.
Yeah.
When you talk to adolescents, is there any gender-specific issue, like talking to, let's say, a female versus talking to a male? I would imagine.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, but then would there be anything? I'd be interested in knowing about that.
Of course, definitely. One of the things that I did not touch, as I told you right in the beginning, I did not want to this session to look like a PG, a psychology session, but literature is rich, and we also taught that gender plays a very, very important role in determining how you absorb stresses in your life. Especially puberty plays a very, very role in in a female patient, and especially in the young adolescents, their worries about early menopause, their fertility issues are more prominent and can be distress-causing source for them. Whereas for men, the gender, it says that they look like they are very, capable of handling this. And when I spoke in the slide about physical disposition and cognitive maturity, that was more in terms of male, as the research pointed out. But for them, it is anger more. Whereas for female, it is more because of the emotional part of it, and the gender male still tries very remotely, very selectively on and off, trying to get the problem focus strategy, whereas female continues to move in the trajectory of emotion focused strategy. That was the reason.
Yeah, so there are a few other questions, no time. So I would suggest that people, like there was something about how to manage spiritual issues. I think it's very important, but no time. So what would be a good idea, Ganpati, is that
I've sent my mail ID in the presentation.
Yeah. But the question is asked by her, but please give your answer to everybody. Okay?
Sure. Okay. I'll send it to Nisha and she will send it to everybody.
Yeah. Okay. So Arun, is that all right? We're
yes. Thank you, sir.
Yeah.
Thank you
okay. So thank you very much, Ganpati, for a awesome talk on a very difficult subject. We can go on and on because there is so much for us to learn. I think this is an interesting subject. We should offline continue this discussion and perhaps have another session on this. May not be on a Monday morning, but it will be some other time for people who are interested.
Yeah.
So
I have only one request, that while Seema is also here, you also there. I'm just wondering whether can we take this study further and we can get into some kind of research in our
Excellent. Seema is my boss, so if she says yes, we will do it. Okay.
Seema, before I close the session, are you there? I don't know. So for a change, you become actual boss and tell her that this is our request.
No, but we will. I'm sure there'll be a lot of interest. We'll definitely work on it. We'll talk offline. So thank you very much. So all of you, please take care. All of us are going through a bad time, and we need to hope and pray that things settle down. So have a wonderful week, and we'll catch you next week. God bless. Take care.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you. Thank you, Ganpati. Thank you, everybody.
Nisha and Archana, for everything.
Of course, thank you, Nisha, all the time. Yes. And Archana too. Thank you.